Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me. So as Caroline said, I have been in the API space for a while now. I think mainly because that's just the way I see the world. I see the world as systems. I see the world as systems that need to talk to one another, that need to share data. So I'm an engineer by background, so it's just natural that I would want to do that. And the more I got into technology, the more I realized there's a lot of value in being able to work off of someone else's projects and work off of someone else's work that they've shared, so that you don't have to start over from scratch. It's just the way engineering works in a lot of situations. It's just the way online coding works, right? With things like GitHub and things like open source code. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience in that world and what I've been doing for the last few years, but really how I got started in this game in the first place. So really about how I found my own trail down this path. So I got started in the mobile world about 10 years ago. I was working on this product called Sony Music Box. And it was actually a startup that Sony acquired. And what we were doing was trying to bring music and images and artist content to mobile phones. And this was in 2001, 2002, something along those lines. And way before we had smartphones, way before people were thinking about stuff like this, way before data speeds on your phone were even fast enough to actually support something like this. But we had a lot of fun doing this. It took a couple of years to actually get it going, and it took a few years to actually for users to catch up and customers to catch up. But once they did, it was a very big business because it proved that you didn't have to sit in front of your computer to buy content. You could use your phone. And then it gave me another insight, which are twofold. One is that back then, there were many different types of phones and handsets. I don't know if you remember, like as recently as 12 years ago, you weren't able to send a text message from your Verizon phone to an AT&T phone. Right? That was the world that we lived in. Every handset was different. Every piece of code you had to write had to be tested individually. So that got me thinking a lot about just platforms overall. You know, what platform is going to win out? What phones will win out? Why there is no common shared API for displaying data and sharing data and so on and so forth. And the second thing Sony taught me was this idea that technology, and more importantly mobile phones, could be used to augment our life. So as we go around in the real world, not only could we buy that song that we listen to, we could Shazam it and we could immediately download it, but perhaps it could also help us see the world as well. Help us discover something when you're out traveling, like in Tokyo or something like that, and help you find things that your friends might have marked down. So that led me away from Sony. I just quit my job and took that risk and jumped into it. And I went to help some friends out with this idea called Socialite, which Caroline mentioned. I was already working on something in that space, which is the idea of discovery of places, bookmarking places. And I thought these guys are onto something interesting. They have kind of a start in this space, so I started to help them out. And the idea behind Socialite, again, as I mentioned, was to bring what we know about the real world and to bring some experience that we want to make easy in the real world and just use the mobile phone to make that faster and more efficient. So we were basically trying to build a platform on mobiles. And this was around 2006, 2007, before iPhone, before Android. That would actually enable you to walk around and be notified about interesting tips that your friends might have left around town and when you're traveling. And while I was working on this project, I got to know a lot about not just the mobile ecosystem, which by now had gone from like 40 devices to maybe 3 or 4 major handsets, and then a year later iPhone came out. But the other thing that I noticed was just the disparate nature in which places were organized around the world. You had something like Wikipedia that had some sort of catalog of the most popular things. You had a couple of companies like Locationary and a few other things that cataloged local businesses. But there was really no one shared resource that people could build upon. You could go after companies like Locationary and kind of pay them to use their data, but they didn't cover enough. And you could use something like Wikipedia, which was free, but again, it only had hundreds of places, not the thousands or millions that are actually in the real world. So if you're walking down the street, you wouldn't be able to tag something in Socialite for your favorite restaurant because that restaurant wouldn't exist in the cloud, wouldn't exist in the service. So that got me thinking a lot about, well, we have to make that. And I don't understand why that doesn't exist. But I never got a chance to really do it here, even though I started an API for Socialite and got a few people to actually build upon us. We just never had the kind of the data and kind of enough community input to actually get that going and to get that really to spread. So after that, while I was working on that, I started to kind of incubate a new idea. And that new idea became Foursquare. And there are a lot of different ways people probably see Foursquare. They see it as ways to get deals. They see it as a way to earn rewards. They see it as this Amex integration where you can get cash back. They see it as points and badges. But really, the way we started Foursquare was, again, very similar to the original concept that I had closer to when I was working at Sony, was just three things. Keep track of all the places that you want to go to. So you have bookmarks in your computer for browser links. Why not have a bookmark of real-world places? Tag your favorite places so you could share it with your friends. You could say, here's my Tokyo list, here's my date list, and so on. And then share and meet up with friends. If we're enabling this idea of real-time sharing of data in the real world, maybe we could also enable you to get away from your computer and away from your home to go meet up with people and learn and experience new things together with them. So all along, I've been kind of fascinated by the idea of platforms for mobile. So how can we make that better? When iPhone and Android came out, they clearly made it a lot easier for all of us because no longer did you have to work in fragmented ways across tons of different Brew and J2ME and Symbian devices, but you really had 2 or 3 major platforms to work for. They reduced a lot of the complexity, code and sharing-wise. And then secondly, as I mentioned, I was really interested in the idea of platforms or APIs for places. I like using the word platforms sometimes when I'm talking about APIs, because to me, as an engineer, API is just almost just the language through which you communicate, but a platform can indicate other things that go around it. It can indicate the community, it can indicate the language of communication, it can indicate the data, it can indicate all these different business products that you might want to put out there into the real world. So I really started to pay a lot more attention to the idea of, again, that original goal of an API for places. Why don't we have a shared resource where we can say, give me all the places nearby, or give me the most popular places nearby, or give me the places that I went to that are nearby. And finally, when we started to really build Foursquare, we got a chance to do this. We got a chance to do it because in the very early days, of course, we had to build our own API so that our own mobile apps could talk to our cloud. But then through use of that API, we slowly made it available to others and made available even more data through this API. So all of our places, since the beginning of Foursquare, has always been free for other people to use. And in the 4 years, not very long at all, when you think about how long it takes to build big platforms, almost most online social web properties and most online services actually use the Foursquare API to provide their places data. So Instagram, for instance, when you go to tag a location, is actually coming from real-time Foursquare data, not static data. Real-time data that other people, Foursquare users around the world, are updating. Sound tracking, as an example, Path, a lot of the quantified self devices and apps and so on, Bing Maps, Waze. So all of these different services actually make use of real-time crowdsourced place data from Foursquare. So what do I think about platforms? There are a couple of things that I've learned over the years. So platforms provide ways, basically, through which you can get your data into the hands of other people, hackers, thinkers, business partners, maybe even internal engineers, just a way to kind of document and put together discrete pieces of things that they can use much more easily, as opposed to just the raw data, or as opposed to having no access. And this data set, I think, probably lies in 3 different ways. The platform that you share. One is the idea of this structure. This is the best word I could come up with. It's a structure of objects. So that is places, as we saw with Foursquare. It could be things, as with an Amazon API or the Netflix API or so on. Just objects that are out there that people have mapped or companies have mapped. They could be user-related objects, right? If I want to go to a service and say, show me all the Netflix movies that I've rated, I should be able to do that. So they could take that form as well. And lastly, it's an idea of a process. And a process could be a calculation or a search. So when you actually tell Google, give me a set of resources, you're essentially outsourcing the process so that you don't have to do it. Google can do it and just send you the results. Another example is geocoding, right? Geocoding is basically the idea of saying, OK, the address is 295 Lafayette Street. What is a lat long there? So you send that process to someone else to do the calculation for you and send back the data. So the collection of all these types of things are really what makes a platform. And so platforms are things that enable and cultivate. Number one, platforms enable the development of products that probably wouldn't otherwise get made. They probably wouldn't otherwise get made because you yourself don't have time to do it. Maybe you and your company just don't have it on your roadmap. Maybe you didn't even think about it. Maybe it was a little bit of a blind spot. Maybe it took the idea of an API or a platform to get out there so that other people could say, wait, I didn't think this could happen, but I think I can actually mash it up with someone else and pull it together. Right? It opens up avenues that probably would never have been able to have gotten done. And from a personal experience, we actually saw this firsthand. About 3 weeks after we launched Foursquare, this was March of 2009, this guy, Joe LaPena, reverse engineered our API. We hadn't even published anything. We were going to do it eventually, but we were only 2 guys. As I like to say, we were 2 guys. We didn't even have a garage. And so he reverse engineered the original API. And I sort of freaked out because there's no documentation here. It could crash at any time. You have no idea. I could change it at any moment, and then his app could crash. But so alongside him, we decided to work alongside him and release the version 1 of our API. And one of the first things he did was he said, you guys only are on iPhone, but half the population here that loves you is on Android. So he decided to reverse engineer the API and built off of our API something called Foursquare, which was the first Android app for Foursquare. It was a free app, all open source, so other people could contribute to it. I contributed, Joe did, and a couple of other people, Alex, Andy, Mark. So there were only a handful of guys, 4 or 5 guys that actually did it. And for a long time, it remained open. So the lesson here was that the crowd actually told us, in a way, not only was the crowd able to satisfy 50% of the market of our user base with an application that was free that everyone could use, but the crowd also informed us what we should build next, right? Should we build a BlackBerry app? Again, this is 2009. Should we go Android? And the crowd was actually able to tell us, this is the direction you need to go. So eventually what we did, about 9 months after he started this project, we brought on Mark full-time into our team, and we actually started to build a more solid Android app off of our official API. And we continued to make it open source and release it as open source. So all of our learnings were actually shared back into the community. So for a long time, it stayed that way. Another thing that we saw was that we were always really curious about the idea of quantified self, which is a concept of tracking numbers about yourself, different things about yourself. It could be your weight, it could be your runs, but tracking these things to kind of for self-improvement or just for observation visualization. So Foursquare naturally lends itself to quantified self. You're tagging yourself everywhere you go in the world. You leave tips. So a couple of people actually took this data and they created even better visualizations than we ever could have. This one guy took all travel data. So he basically took airport data points from Foursquare for a particular user. So this is me. And this is me historically for the last 5 or 6 years. And he basically said where in the world this user goes. And he shows you real-time visualizations. And this updates. As soon as they go check into an airport, this changes. So it's actually keeping track of all the miles I've traveled in a plane, kind of a lot. It gives you a little CO2 number at the very end, which I don't want to show you. And it's actually really cool to see. I've covered a lot of the world, but I don't get anywhere near south of the equator as much as maybe I should. So it opens up the data in ways that you wouldn't be able to see just in a list. Another thing he did is this I love. This is how many airports did we really go to? And JFK is the one that I most often go to, SFO because of work, Newark for international. And then there's just all of these other places that I had no idea that I even went, but Foursquare remembered for me. And he was able to actually extract this and show it to me in a really fantastic way. So this kind of stuff we never would have been able to do because our core focus is, again, maintaining that core places platform, is to design a really great business and user experience, and it's to design a very engaging product that the majority of our users will use. And he's really taken it and shown what else you can actually do with that data that's being locked away. Had we never released an API, he would never have been able to do this. Were the data never able to be pulled out on a user-by-user basis, he would never have been able to do something like this. Another really fantastic example, and this one I really like because it actually combines a lot of different services, is a service called Earned It. There was always this idea of why don't we get karma for doing something online? This was actually an idea I had many years ago. And even when Foursquare started, the idea of points in Foursquare started out as a little bit like karma. If I do some good in the world, if I share a tip with you, maybe I should get 5 points, which I can then take and do something else with. And so I was happy to see something like this come along. The more I run and the more I do, maybe it should actually reward me. Maybe 1, it should actually donate money to charity, or maybe 2, the more working out I do, maybe the more points I get, which I can then reward myself and get a protein shake or something. So that was kind of clever. Taking different sources like Foursquare, Moves, Runkeeper, Nike Plus, and so on, and mashing them all together. So it doesn't just come from one place. It actually comes from a lot of different places. And had we not all had APIs, we would never have been able to do this. We have no reason to go to Nike and Runkeeper and say, hey, do you guys have a little 20% time? Do you want to do something interesting? No one would say yes. We just don't have that kind of time as business owners. On a more interesting note, there are actually 2 examples of this. Netflix I love. I don't know how many of you have Netflix. I've had it for so long. There's not a movie I don't watch that I don't rate on Netflix, even if I didn't watch on Netflix. So Netflix has probably a record of 1,500, 1,600 movies that I've watched over the last 10 years. And it's kind of great. Netflix recommendations are also really great. But sometimes you just want a different kind of ranking. Netflix only gives you a ranking that, based on the movies that you watch, here's what we think you would like. Or based on the movies that your girlfriend actually watched, here's what we think you'd like, right? And so what this does is actually, these guys have taken, it's called Instant Watcher. They take the New York Times popular list and other critic picks and so on, and they actually bring it together with the Netflix data to show you a new kind of ranking. So if you want to see something award-winning, if you want to see it's like Oscar time and you're like, I got to catch up, here's a better way to do it. Another fantastic example, and an even prettier example, is this thing called the Better Queue. And these guys have taken Rotten Tomatoes data, right? So critic picks and newspaper reviews, and they mash it together with Netflix data. So they show you in an even better way, like if you just wanted to watch the 10 best of this year, you would easily be able to do this on this. And it's actually really accurate. It's actually pretty good. I've actually tested it a couple of times. There's an app that a few of you use, I think it's called Moves. It's basically an activity tracker. So as opposed to having, wearing the Fuel Band or wearing like a little device like the Shine in your pocket, what this does is just an app that runs on your phone that constantly tracks your movement. When you're walking, it knows you're walking. When you're on a bicycle, it knows you're moving a little bit faster, so it calculates as a bicycle. When you're in the subway, you lose signal, so it seems to know that you're in the subway. It's really cool. It tracks passively using GPS and a couple of other sensors what's actually going on in your life day to day. Where are you moving around? And it was cool. It was interesting when I saw this. A friend of mine actually did this. Moves is very single-player experience, is what I like to call it. It's only my data. It's only on my phone. No one else ever gets to see it. So what he did was say, well, how are you moving? How's Caroline moving compared to me? How are you guys moving compared to me? And he made a very interesting kind of game dashboard. So you could see how you compare against the best of the moves people as well as all of your friends. And by perhaps opening up this data, you can get a better sense of how much you're moving and have little competitions in your office or something like that. Two, platforms enable and cultivate. Platforms provide the ability for you as a company to acquire an idea or product or a team. I was giving you the example of the Foursquare Android app. And this was a great example because it's not something that we were working on initially. We wanted to get to where in the timeline does it fit, we don't know. But the community actually informed us, here's when you need to do it and here's what you need to do it. So that Foursquare thing that I was showing you, this is what it looks like now, the Android app. It's come a long way since the early days of just the open source nature. So basically, the idea here is that the platform actually informed us, hey, this is the product that you need to do next. In some cases, like with Parse, Parse is a company that is not just an idea that a company says, oh, that's really good, the community's doing it, let's do it. Or that's a really good product, we should do that product too. But it was an entire team that did this. And Facebook actually picked up the entire team. Because what Parse was doing is they were taking all the different APIs across all the different major services, so push notifications and Facebook login, and Twitter login, and so on, and they combined it all into one piece. So you could do all of these things with a much cleaner API. So they're themselves an API company. And Facebook saw this, and they realized, wait, this actually makes things a lot easier for our developers. If our developers have to spend 10% less time, 15% less time, whatever it is, actually doing a lot of this stuff, then the better for it, because they're going to develop even more applications. If we could take away a lot of the complexity. So in this case, in our case with the Foursquare, we were able to acquire a little bit of a product or like an idea of a direction. In this case, Facebook just acquired the entire company, right? They got a lot of really smart engineers and a really great product that cuts across a lot of different services. It solves a really, really good problem that a lot of developers have. Twitter is another example. I'll just go through a couple of big examples. Surmise was an acquisition by Twitter. Surmise was a company that was actually based here in New York. And they were doing a lot of different things, interesting things with like sentiment analysis and trying to predict trends and like what people were talking about and so on. But the thing that they ended up being really good at was search. And in 2006, 2007, 2008, Twitter was just not good at search at all. They just weren't, the team wasn't big enough. You couldn't search for things. Nowadays, we sit on Twitter and we're like, we just follow the Super Bowl hashtag. Back then, this is hard to believe, but they just couldn't do any of that stuff. And Surmise was actually doing it. This is the way the interface looked in 08 when they were acquired. So you could just go in here and type anything. In 08, you could just see the top topics back then, like flashback, Obama, and Clinton, and so on. And so Twitter saw that they were creating something really valuable on top of their platform via their API, by the way. There's no other way Surmise could have done this. So an entire company was created. Venture capitalists went after it, and were able to enable it to be created. It was created off of the Twitter platform, and then Twitter actually eventually brought it in. They brought the engineers as well as the product. And so Surmise and a lot of this stuff eventually became Twitter Search. It was search.twitter for a while, and then now it's Twitter Discover. So anytime you go into any Twitter search bar, these are the things that are actually powering it. And now if you think about Twitter, Twitter would be not as powerful without search. It's come a long way since. definitely. But search is what really enables you to like cut across things, see what people are saying, see what brands are talking about, see how people are reacting to the products that you released, and so on. Another more recent example, because Twitter is really getting into TV recently, and this idea of the second screen, a buddy's company, again in New York City, called Trender, started to do the sentiment analysis and this idea of like who's talking about what in real time based on Twitter data. And so Trender was also acquired by Twitter less than a month ago. 3, platforms enable and cultivate. Platforms cultivate communities. And I think this is the most important point. We naturally had this with Foursquare. I think I told you in the Sony days, we didn't really know our users. We were creating a product, we put it in the Verizon or AT&T app store, and then someone downloaded it. We saw the downloads, we saw a lot of money, and that was good enough. We never made the connection with the user. With the socialite days, we made a little bit more of a connection with the user. We knew who they were, we could talk to them, we could have a conversation, we had comments and all that. But it never grew big enough to really create the community. But the Foursquare case was a really unique one because the community really loved the product and the community really helped guide some of the direction of the product even. And I'm not just talking about beta users, it was real users post-launch. And just as the community actually guided the direction of the product and what they were interested in talking about and the use of the product and the use of things like specials, the community actually helped on the API side as well. So I was referring to the Moves app. This is the way the Moves app looks. It constantly tracks you in the background. It knows when you're at home because you're there between certain hours and you just tag it. So the first time you tag it, you say, this is my home. And anytime you come back into that radius, it automatically tags you as home. You never have to tag you as home. And then it knows when you're walking. It knows when you're moving much faster. It just calls it transport. It knows when you're on a bicycle just based on the way you pedal. It knows work. And then it knows other things as well, like 4-barrel coffee and so on and so forth. By the way, that data, 4-barrel coffee, comes from Foursquare. So as an example of the community, all Moves did was this app. This is all they did. There's nothing else to it. There's no user account. There's nothing. It's very simple. You just launch it. You put it away in your pocket. Maybe you look at it every once in a while, but that's all it does. So the community said, wait, this is actually really great. This thing is constantly tracking us. You're able to give us a layer over it through an API. So not only are you doing this automatically, but we don't have to write the underlying code to constantly track someone. You're giving us that data for free. So the community started to make really fantastic applications on top of it. Proves is something I showed you, which is the leaderboard. Who's walking the most? Gary with 15 miles, Dennis with 35, and so on. Another really clever one, this is one I really love. This is an idea of saying, where were you in July 2013? So for every moment that I ever had that Moves app on in my pocket, it automatically tagged and it actually knows how much time I spent at each place. So I spent a lot of time at home, naturally. Space Center is number 2. That's my studio on Broome and Center Street. And I spent the second most amount of time there. I went to DC for a conference. I tend to go to the Crosby Street Hotel a lot for breakfast. And it's really fantastic to look at all this stuff after the fact. So very similar to Foursquare, but all of this data is actually, for me, already on Foursquare, but this actually captures some of the things that might be lost otherwise. Where are these unknown places? How much time do I actually really spend at home? And so on. I think it's actually really clever. A friend of mine, Nicholas Feltron, who loves doing visualizations, he's the guy, Caroline was talking about me releasing a personal API because I'm not a visualization guy, but he's a designer. And for the last 7 or 8 years, what he's been doing is at the end of the year, he releases an annual report of himself. You can get it online as well as a physical printed book. And the annual report basically shows off everything that he's been tracking about himself. So this most recent one, you could go through it, and every year it changes. He tried to change up the design and improve on it. So every year you could see, who do I hang out the most with? Where do I spend most of my time? What am I working on? What movies did I watch? How many cups of coffee did I have? So he's even more of a quantified selfer than I am. He's very, very meticulous about all this stuff. And if you actually look at his data, you can actually see, as far as work-related stuff, it's like a lot of time is spent actually tracking data. And the number 2 is like spent actually working on building the personal report. So to give you a sense of like how much time it takes. So he actually took the Moves data, this thing that's in your pocket, and he mapped it out. So he could see like where he's actually going around. And how much he actually moves around. So like on the lower left corner, you could see he was at the DMV a couple of times. You could see a couple of the bars that he went to. That over there is Manhattan. This here is in Brooklyn. So you can easily tell he lives in Brooklyn. He lives somewhere in Williamsburg. You can tell it's Manhattan because Le Poisson Rouge and Spotted Pig and all these other places are there. You get a sense of like how much he moves across between things. But most often you know that he commutes mostly in Brooklyn. The blue is biking. he stays mostly in Brooklyn and goes to other places in Brooklyn. So Moves has created a fantastic community. They have maybe a handful of apps, 20-something apps or so. They've only been around for a year, year and a half. And it's really great because the community has been able to do all the things that Moves just probably isn't interested in doing and maybe just doesn't have time to do. But more importantly, just like Parse and just like Foursquare, they've removed a layer of complexity by making available a platform. So when I want to do something really cool like a visualization, I would never have to go and design an app and try to track location and try to not waste battery life and blah, 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 all this stuff. And I think that's the real power. They've created a community around making something easier. So a platform gives you an opportunity to cultivate a community of these developers and these thinkers and these product guys and these business guys. So from that, you can acquire ideas for things you yourself should build, either as an individual, as a project, or as a company. And then from that, you can enable others to build things you yourself don't have the time to build. Thank you.